The lecture hall was packed. Students sat shoulder to shoulder, some leaning forward in anticipation, others exchanging quiet whispers. The reason? Tonight was not just another philosophy lecture, it was a spectacle. Dr. Richard Calloway, a renowned atheist professor, was known for his cutting critiques of religion, particularly Christianity. His lectures often turned into public takedowns of faith, leaving believers squirming in their seats. Tonight, however, there was a different energy in the room. Among the crowd, sitting calmly in the front row, was Barron Trump. The son of the former president had never been one to seek public debates, but tonight he had been invited as a special guest. Dr. Calloway smirked as he took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "welcome to another evening of reason versus superstition. Tonight, we're going to discuss why the belief in God is not only outdated but downright dangerous." A round of laughter erupted from some students. Others remained silent, their gazes flickering toward Barron. He sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here for an argument. He was here for the truth. The professor continued, pacing the stage. For centuries, religion has been used to control minds, stifle progress, and justify atrocities. And yet, in this very room, I'm sure there are still those who cling to the idea of an invisible man in the sky controlling their fate. He turned, his eyes locking onto Barron. Perhaps young Mr. Trump would like to defend such an idea. A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes were on Barron. Barron stood slowly, his tall frame commanding attention. He adjusted his suit jacket and took a step toward the microphone. There was no rush, no anxiety in his movements, only quiet confidence. "Dr. Calloway," he began, his voice even, "you've built your career on the premise that faith is irrational. But I have to ask, do you believe that science has explained everything?" The professor chuckled. "Ah, the classic science doesn't know everything argument. Science doesn't claim to have all the answers, but unlike religion, it seeks them." Barron nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, the deeper science digs, the more questions arise. Quantum mechanics, consciousness, the origins of the universe. These remain vast mysteries. So, tell me, what is more irrational? Believing in something beyond what we can currently measure, or assuming that human understanding is the absolute limit of truth?" Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some students exchanged glances, surprised by Barron's composure. Calloway smirked. "Ah, so you're saying because we don't know everything, we should just insert God as the answer?" Barron shook his head. "No, I'm saying that humility is the foundation of wisdom. The greatest scientific minds in history, Newton, Einstein, Planck, acknowledged the possibility of a higher power. But you, sir, claim absolute certainty in something that is fundamentally uncertain." For the first time, the professor hesitated. Calloway straightened his posture, determined to regain control of the discussion. "Let's talk morality," he said. "If God exists, why is there suffering? Why do innocent people die? Why do the wicked thrive?" Barron didn't blink. That's a profound question, but it assumes that suffering is evidence of God's absence rather than human free will. If we lived in a world where no suffering existed, would we truly be free, or would we be puppets? The professor narrowed his eyes. "So your God allows suffering because he values free will?" Barron took a step forward. "He allows choice. Without choice, there is no love, no sacrifice, no growth. If there were no suffering, how would we understand compassion? If there were no injustice, how would we learn to seek justice?" A slow murmur rippled through the audience. Even those who had laughed earlier now sat in contemplation. Calloway, sensing the shift, pressed on. "But your so-called God sits back while children starve and wars rage. Isn't that cruel?" Barron's gaze didn't waver. Is it cruelty or is it consequence? When humanity chooses greed over generosity, war over peace, should we blame God or ourselves? Silence. Calloway cleared his throat. All right, then let's talk evidence. Do you have proof that God exists? Barron smiled slightly. Do you have proof that he doesn't? The professor scoffed. The burden of proof is on the believer. Barron tilted his head. That's convenient. But let's test your reasoning. Can you see gravity? Calloway frowned. No, but we observe its effects. Exactly, Barron said. You don't see gravity, but you believe in its presence because of its impact. You don't see thoughts, but you acknowledge their existence. The same logic applies to faith. You may not see God, but millions experience His presence. To dismiss all of that is not intellectual, it's arrogant. A few students clapped. Calloway's jaw tightened. He had debated countless believers before, but something about Barron's composure was different. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't aggressive. He was simply unshaken. Calloway exhaled sharply. All right, he said, his voice less confident than before. You make some interesting points. But at the end of the day, faith is just a crutch for those who fear the unknown. Barron didn't hesitate. Or perhaps it's a foundation for those who seek meaning beyond themselves. The room was silent. Then one clap, then another. Within seconds, half the audience was on their feet. Even those who didn't share Barron's beliefs seemed to respect his poise and intelligence. Calloway, now visibly rattled, adjusted his tie. I think we'll end the discussion here, he muttered. Barron nodded, stepping away from the microphone. Thank you for the conversation, Professor. Dialogue is always more valuable than dismissal. As he returned to his seat, a group of students approached him, eager to continue the discussion. Meanwhile, Calloway remained on the stage, lost in thought. He had expected an easy debate, a chance to dismantle another religious argument. Instead, he had walked away questioning his own certainty. That night, social media exploded with clips of the exchange. Hashtags like #BarronSpeaks and #FaithAndReason trended worldwide. Even news outlets that typically criticize the Trump family had to acknowledge one thing. Barron Trump had not only defended faith but had done so with a level of intelligence and respect that few had ever expected. And as for Dr. Calloway, he would never underestimate his audience again. The room was no longer just an audience. It was an arena. The professor, Dr. Samuel Grayson, leaned forward, his smirk unwavering. He thrived on intellectual battles, but this time, something felt different. Barron Trump wasn't reacting with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he maintained a calm yet authoritative demeanor that unsettled even the most confident skeptics. So, Barron, Grayson said, his voice laced with mock curiosity, if your faith is so strong, perhaps you can explain why an all-powerful God would allow suffering in the world. Why do innocent people endure tragedies while supposed sinners walk free? A few chuckles rippled through the room. It was the classic problem of evil argument, one that had left many religious students fumbling for an answer. But Barron didn't flinch. Free will, he said simply, his voice steady. God doesn't create suffering, people do. He gave us free will, the ability to choose good or evil. Without it, we'd be nothing more than programmed robots, incapable of love, growth, or moral responsibility. The professor raised an eyebrow. Ah, the free will defense, convenient. But tell me, Barron, does free will apply to natural disasters? To childhood illnesses? Where's the choice in that? Barron leaned forward slightly. Even in the worst of circumstances, people have the choice to respond with kindness or cruelty, with faith or despair. Some of the greatest human achievements, the most inspiring acts of heroism, were born out of suffering. If there were no challenges, there would be no growth. For the first time, Grayson hesitated. He wasn't expecting such a composed and well-thought-out response. The murmurs in the audience had shifted. This was no longer a one-sided debate. Sensing a shift in the room, Grayson changed tactics. He waved a dismissive hand. "All right, let's talk science, evolution, the Big Bang, actual facts. Religion relies on blind faith, while science is based on evidence." Barron tilted his head slightly. "Science and faith aren't enemies, Dr. Grayson. Many of the greatest scientists in history, Newton, Pascal, even Einstein, acknowledged the existence of a higher power. Science explains the how. Faith explains the why. They work together." The professor chuckled. "So, you're saying God and science are compatible? That's rich." Barron didn't miss a beat. "Absolutely. The more we learn about the universe, the more complex and fine-tuned it appears. The conditions required for life to exist are so precise that many scientists acknowledge it as evidence of intelligent design. Even atheists like Richard Dawkins admit that the universe appears designed." Grayson's smile faltered slightly. The audience leaned in, sensing his discomfort. He had expected a naive response, blind devotion, empty rhetoric. Instead, he was facing well-researched arguments that dismantled his assumptions. "So," Grayson said, forcing a grin, "you're telling me that because things are complicated, there must be a God? That's not science, that's wishful thinking." Barron met his gaze. "Then explain consciousness. Explain morality. Explain why humans across history, across cultures, have an innate sense of good and evil. Science can measure the brain, but it can't explain the mind. It can analyze behavior, but it can't define the soul." The room was silent. Grayson shifted in his chair. He wasn't used to being the one on the defensive. He had humiliated students in debates before, tearing apart their arguments with surgical precision. But this was different. Desperate to regain control, he scoffed. "Barron, you come from wealth, from privilege. Isn't it easy for you to believe in a benevolent God when you've never faced real hardship?" A few gasps escaped from the audience. The attack was personal now, but Barron remained calm. "You assume I haven't faced struggles because of my background. But suffering isn't just about money. Everyone faces challenges. Loss, doubt, betrayal. Faith isn't about escaping hardship, it's about finding meaning in it." Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but Barron continued, his voice unwavering. "And let's be honest, Dr. Grayson, your argument isn't against God. It's against people who have misrepresented him. Yes, religion has been misused. People have done terrible things in God's name. But that doesn't mean faith itself is wrong. Should we reject love because some people have twisted it into control? Should we reject justice because some abuse power?" The professor swallowed. The very foundation of his arguments was crumbling beneath him. Grayson took a deep breath, trying to muster one last counterpoint. "All right, Barron, I'll give you this. You're articulate. But at the end of the day, there's no proof, no evidence of God. Faith is just believing without seeing." Barron nodded slowly, as if considering the statement. Then he leaned forward, locking eyes with the professor. "Do you love anyone, Dr. Grayson?" The question caught him off guard. "What? Do you love anyone?" Barron repeated. "A parent? A sibling? A friend?" Grayson hesitated. "Of course." Barron nodded. "Can you prove it?" The professor blinked. "Well, I can show actions." Barron tilted his head. "Exactly. Love isn't something you can put under a microscope or measure in a test tube, but you know it's real. Faith is the same way. You don't see God in a petri dish. You see him in the beauty of creation, in the kindness of others, in the longing for meaning that every human carries." The professor had no response. A hush settled over the room. Barron Trump sat back, his posture relaxed, his expression calm. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't triumphant, he was simply sure. Grayson exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. He looked at the audience, then at Barron. Finally, with a half-hearted chuckle, he muttered, "Well, you certainly weren't the pushover I expected." The crowd erupted into applause. Some students stood, others nodded in agreement. Even those who had initially sided with Grayson had to admit it. Barron had held his ground with dignity, intelligence, and unwavering confidence. As the applause settled, Barron spoke one last time. "Dr. Grayson, I respect your right to question faith, but maybe, just maybe, faith isn't as blind as you think." With that, he stood, nodded politely, and walked out of the lecture hall. Grayson sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty stage. He had come into this debate expecting to crush another naive believer. Instead, he had been the one left questioning. And deep down, for the first time in years, he wondered, what if he was wrong? Within hours, clips of the debate flooded social media. Barron Trump's calm yet powerful defense of faith became the center of discussion across news outlets, podcasts, and blogs. People from all walks of life, believers and skeptics alike, found themselves rethinking their stance. One thing was certain: this was a debate no one would forget.